the requirements for a country to realize its demographic dividend that Professor Devender Singh in one of his slides pointed out in a minute. And I will indeed also come back to two very important points that Dr. Kulkarni made, who said, who I think cautioned us very importantly that for brevity, I'm going to call it the DD, not the demographic dividend, with your permission, Mr. Chair. He cautioned us that the DD in India is going to be moderate, unlike that in China. The second way in which he cautioned us was that in many ways, given the differential pace at which populations are growing in different parts of our country, a smooth transition from north to south would be absolutely critical, and I will come back to this issue. But let me actually focus a little bit on the fact that the dividend itself is likely to be moderate in India as compared to China. But let's just see what the success of China was during the period of its demographic dividend. What was the nature of its success? And I think very rightly, Jayan has already pointed to that. One, they pulled workers out of agriculture very rapidly because the economy grew from 1980 to for the next 30 years at something like 9 to 10% per annum. And India has not achieved that kind of growth rate, and certainly not that consistency of a 30-year period of 9 to 10%. The second big difference between China and India is the investments they made in health, education, and social transfers, a subject that I will come back to, and Jayan has already pointed to that, and I will develop that a little bit further. And because they generated jobs with their 9 to 10% growth, that's the third difference, in the non-farm sector very rapidly, thereby raising productivity across the economy, because they focused on industry and manufacturing in particular. And I don't think it is sufficiently realized either among policymakers in our country or among academics that services may be fine as a job provider, but by and large, services generate relatively skilled jobs, and our workers just don't have that profile. Meanwhile, manufacturing, if we had been focusing on labor-intensive manufacturing, then it could generate jobs across the economy, and then we could possibly move up the value chain ladder. Unfortunately, as Jayan hinted, unfortunately, our labor-intensive manufacturing has not been growing, and therefore, in fact, if it has been, it has actually been contracting in the last 5 to 6 years. So we shouldn't even begin to be comparing ourselves to China, and we must remind ourselves, what are Chinese leaders saying since 2015? Because their dividend gave over from around 2015. They have been saying Europe became old after they became rich. We have become old without becoming rich. Now, please remember, these are the leaders of a country which started out at the same level of per capita income as India in 1979. But because they grew as fast as they did, reduced poverty at the rate at which they did, invested in health and education, they managed to increase their per capita income to a level 4 times ours today. So a very significant part of our dividend is already gone. And, I'd like a further discussion after I've finished about, this distinction that Dr. Jain made between the first phase of the dividend, which he said is ending by 2041, and the second phase, because I'm now going to turn very quickly to why I believe that we are facing a disaster and hardly a dividend at all. But before I turn to that issue, that concern, let me just say two other things that the Chinese leaders are pointing out, which should be red flags for all of us, especially for our policymakers, who of course couldn't care less because they are one of our richest states is in the throes of a political crisis. That's the most that they can think of on the western coast of India. What are the Chinese leaders saying? You see, one of the effects of an aging population, of the share of the working age population, sorry, of the aging population rising above 10% of the population, which is apparently what demographers define as an aging population. And China reached that around 2015, and their working age population has already begun. Is two results, two facts. One, that when your aging population share rises rapidly above 10%, then you have to take into account their A, social security needs, and B, their rising health expenditure at a time when the elderly are living longer, because life expectancy is improving, because health status is improving over the years. And if the vast majority of the population doesn't have social security, a subject that I will come back to, and if the health status of our elderly population is not robust, then we've got even further problems of dealing with elderly. I'll stop there as far as China is concerned. It should be an eye-opener for us. Now let me return to the sort of 5 or 6 preconditions for a country to realize its demographic dividend that Professor Devender Singh rightly pointed out. And the point is that the dividend will be realized if and only if those 5 or 6 conditions are met. The first is jobs. Let me spend very briefly, because Jayan has already spoken about it, just to say that at this current juncture, and for some years now already, there are 3 groups of workers that are waiting to get into non-farm jobs. I emphasize this, non-farm jobs, because no one wants to be in agriculture. In any case, the meaning of structural transformation that should accompany a demographic dividend is not just rising per capita income, but also a rise in the share of industry and services in total GDP, and a fall in the share of agriculture, and a rise in the share of industry and services in employment, and a fall in the share of agriculture. Now, what are we seeing in our country? In the last few years, we've actually, until 2004-5, the absolute number of workers in agriculture was still rising. Or in other words, for 50 years, the absolute number of workers in agriculture was still rising, although the share of workers in agriculture was falling, which shows how slow the structural transformation process was, despite the fact that we were already in the early phases of our demographic dividend. And that process went on till 2019, and that process has been reversed. It has stalled, it has been aborted, and manufacturing employment has actually falling. Manufacturing share of employment is falling in the last 4 or 5 years, and the share of agriculture in the last 2 years has actually risen, and risen very sharply, resulting in a reversal. So who are the 3 groups that are looking for non-farm jobs? One are those who were in agriculture and find that there is too much rural distress and want to leave agriculture. The parents want to leave, so young who are getting better educated, they're looking for work. And please, just to remind yourselves of the numbers, between 2004-5 and 12, we were generating, actually between 2000 and 2012, we were generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs every year. And the economy was growing at 8% per annum by and large. After 2013, the number of non-farm jobs that the economy is generating is only 2.9 million per annum. A drop from 7.5 million to 40% of that level of 2.9 million per annum all the way till 2019. And since then, the situation has even worsened. So that's one group who move out of agriculture. That need to be given non-farm jobs. The second group is the following, that are those who belong to the stock of unemployed. The first group also belong to the stock of workers who need, and if we are to realize our demographic dividend, must get non-farm jobs. This second group consists of the unemployed. Their number, by the usual status, in 2012 was only 10 million, because we were generating new non-farm jobs at a very rapid rate. That number already, on account of the declining growth rate and a worsening of the pattern of growth, which I've hinted at just now, actually increased the absolute number of openly unemployed, increased from 10 million to 30 million by 2019. And that number has increased by additional 7 or 8 million in the last 2 years. That's the second group of people who need non-farm jobs. The third group, and you can see, I've not even mentioned the youth that Jayan was speaking about, the young people, so-called people who are joining the working age, the dividend. They have been joining at the rate of about 5 to 6 million from the last 6 or 7 years, and their number is only going to go on rising, which means at a very minimum we should be generating about 10 to 12 million non-farm jobs, and higher than that as we move along this decade. Right now we should be generating 10 to 12 million, and we are, as I told you, we were generating 2.9. So I've mentioned two sources of the rising stock of those who need non-farm jobs, and now I've just mentioned this rising flow of young people who are joining the working age thanks to the dividend. And this is the situation on jobs. And one of the main reasons, and I won't say very much, I mean, the second condition that Professor Devender Singh pointed out was a high-performing economy. Well, let's just look at the trajectory in respect of the performance of the economy from independence. 1950 to 1980, the economy was growing at 3.5% per annum, but our population was growing at an accelerating pace with every decennial census between 51 and 81, and reached a peak of about 2.6% per annum. At a time, that means on average, the average between 50 and 80 of the population growth rate is about 2.5% per annum, while the GDP growth rate is only 3.5% per annum. That means per capita income was growing at barely 1% per annum. So a massive stock of poor people had already accumulated by the late 70s. And although we had begun to enter our dividend from the early 80s onwards, the important and interesting point is that we do see a rise in the savings rate from the early 80s onwards, and very slow rise in the investment rate, and a rise in the GDP growth rate. In the 80s, it had gone up to 5.4% per annum. The population growth rate had begun to decelerate. So we began to see per capita income growth faster than we had seen in the first 30 years after independence. In other words, not 1, but at least 2.5 to 3% per annum. In the 90s, that picked up again by additional percentage point to about 6.4% per annum. But then in this century, we've seen much, much faster growth rate. Trouble is, since about 2015-16, the growth rate has decelerated, and decelerated extremely sharply, very quickly. And that's the worrying fact about, and the reason why jobs are not growing so rapidly. Quickly, now turning to the factor of health. You know, it's already been pointed out by Jen, but one thing that we need to recall is that health is impacted by nutritional levels of children. And believe it or not, we still are at a country where 35% of our young under the age of 5 is stunted. This is higher than in Africa. I wonder how many, what proportion of our policymakers are even aware of this, and what proportion of our intelligentsia is even aware of this fact. And secondly, health status is impacted by safe sanitation. Before Swachh Bharat began, 60% of the global population that defecated in the open lived in India. We account for only 17% of the world's population. 60%. That 60% share has certainly dropped because of the number of toilets that have been built, but has behavior changed commensurately? No. So we've got two social determinants of health which are very much going against our realizing our demographic dividend. I won't say more than this, because I've already taken about 17.5 minutes. I'll finish in the next 3 or 4 minutes. Second, education. That gives us some ground for some degree of confidence, because we did manage in the last 20 years to increase elementary education enrollment rates, though not learning levels. That's a very serious problem. I don't have to tell you that. We did manage to increase secondary enrollment rates between 2010 and 2015 because of the upward pressure coming from the elementary education enrollment. Secondary education for 15 to 16-year-olds for classes 9 and 10 went up from 58% to 85% with gender parity, which is wonderful news, which is one reason why our population growth rate, even in the northern states, the Hindi belt, has been declining and declining quite fast. However, we know what the learning levels are. We know that the higher education system and even the higher secondary system is turning out unemployables. Now let me turn to the third prerequisite that Professor Devender Singh said, skills. For 10 years, after 50 years of neglecting technical and vocational education, 10 years ago, around 2010 or so, the government became serious about technical and vocational education. What is the status today? You look at the latest NSS data, less than 5% of our workforce, of our relevant age, the workers have any formal vocational training. Less than 5. Compare that to 85% in China and 90% in South Korea. And we are talking about realizing the demographic dividend and competing with China. We must be living in a completely fool's paradise. That means that our skill development programs are completely off mark. Just one more sentence about that the government's approach is supply driven, not demand driven. The government's approach is government will manage finance and deliver the vocational education, when in fact the world over the experience is that wherever it has delivered well and has skilled people to prepare them for jobs are countries where it is industry, employer driven, and it's demand driven. And finally, I will close with the pension issue. 91% of our workforce is informal. That means they have no social insurance. That is today, and that is when we are less than 20 years away for the critical phase of the first phase of our dividend to end. I don't take the second phase of our dividend very seriously. I'd like to be challenged on that statement, but the first phase is what is the most critical one. And unfortunately, we made no progress in the last 15 to 20 years on ensuring pensions for our population. I have a whole paper which proposes how it can be done, but if only someone was listening. And finally, let me go back to what Professor Kulkarni warned us about. As it is, he's warned us that our dividend is going to be moderate. If you are to believe what I have argued, I'm suggesting that we were to think of a threefold classification of mild, moderate, and very, very good, then I would say our dividend is likely to be mild at best, unless we get our policies right. And the final point, this smooth transition from north to south of workers. We are getting to the point of breaking point. What do I mean by that? Because the northern Hindi belt states are simply not generating the jobs. I could give you evidence on that, but I've run out of time. And they are growing much more slowly. I have a separate paper in EPW, September 2021, where I argue on theoretical grounds and also on econometric grounds, essentially the following: why human development should precede economic growth in our states. Essentially 2 sentences. I'm arguing that in the southern and the western states of India, they've managed to grow between 1992 and 2018 at over 7% per annum. But the northern and the eastern states have grown at 5 or less than 5% per annum. And the reason why this is the case, I argue, is because the southern and the western ones, relative to the northern and eastern ones, invested in human development, human capital. And I try and demonstrate this both theoretically as well as econometrically. So as the southern states generate fewer and fewer jobs as they transition to more capital intensive industry, the likelihood of their generating that many jobs is not going to be that great, in which case we are in a serious bind, because they will stop absorbing workers that Professor Kulkarni is hoping they will continue to absorb. And the northern states will simply not get their governance right, or their human capital policies right, or their industry policies right. Thank you very much for your attention.